Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Mary Hartnett, and I'm the Executive Director of Clean Elections Minnesota. Clean Elections Minnesota is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works for an inclusive and healthy democracy. Among our goals are expanding voter access and limiting the power of big and dark money in our political process. We at Clean Elections, along with our co-sponsors, the League of Women Voters Minnesota and FairVote Minnesota, are very concerned with the increased role of super PACs in our elections. Because they can accept unlimited donations, super PACs, funded only by a few people, can be the deciding factor in who wins elections. In fact, during this past election, one single individual gave $238 million to a super PAC he controlled. In November, voters in Maine overwhelmingly supported an initiative that imposed a $5,000 limit on contributions by a single individual to a PAC. Tonight, we have two speakers who are the leading advocates of the Maine initiative. They are Republican State Senator Rick Bennett, who campaigned for the initiative, saying it was a solution that everybody could support, regardless of party, to ensure future generations have a system that works for the people of Maine, not special interests. A former chair of Maine's Republican Party, Senator Bennett himself was reelected in November with 65% of his district's vote and has served in Maine's legislature for a total of 16 years, including a year as state Senate president. He has a reputation as a reformer, an advocate for fiscal discipline, government accountability, and protecting Maine's outdoor heritage. Also with us is the man who proposed the initiative, Harvard Law professor Lawrence Lessig. He believes the initiative, which is already being legally challenged, could and should be approved by the courts. Professor Lessig is the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law at Harvard and has been a national leader in campaign finance reform. Professor Lessig is also a noted thinker on law and technology. Professor Lessig and Senator Bennett will be interviewed tonight by Lori Sturdevant, longtime highly respected editorial writer and columnist from the Star Tribune newspaper. Lori also spent several decades as a political reporter and as an author and three-time Minnesota Book Award winner. Our deep appreciation to the three of you. Now to Lori.
Well, thank you, Mary, and thank you to Clean Elections Minnesota. This has been, at least for me, a worrisome time about the future of our democracy. And that's making this a especially timely occasion to take a look at what has happened in the November election in the state of Maine. Maine's voters, as you said, passed a referendum by a pretty big margin that would rein in big money's corrupting influence on our elections. Now, that's something that a lot of us have been wishing could happen for a long time, people on both the left and the right. But for years, we felt powerless to do anything about it. Well, Maine's voters are challenging that feeling. They're telling us that just maybe we aren't so powerless after all. I'm a history buff, as you know, and I know it's not unusual for Minnesotans to look to the state of Maine for some political inspiration. In fact, in the middle of the 19th century, a lot of the people who created Minnesota's state government were from the state of Maine and its neighboring New England states as well. We look to Maine as one of our mother states here, and many of our ideas about participatory democracy have come from that region of the country. I know that Maine and Minnesota regularly vie to this day to lead the nation in voter turnout. And I know that in 1973, Minnesota beat Maine by 1 day in enacting same-day registration, election day registration for voters, which really helped create a movement for making real the promise that American citizens voting is a right, not a privilege. Well, what has Maine done now? That's what we're here to find out about tonight, and that's where I'd like to start with the two people who are here to brief us. Senator Rick Bennett, I'd like to start with you to hear what question 1 in Maine was all about. What can you tell us?
Sure. Well, I will, first of all, thank you, Lori, and thank you, Mary, for the generous introduction, and Lori for your taking up this moderating role here, and thank you all for your interest in what we're doing in Maine. Because it really is designed to have national implications. And I can let Professor Lessig get into the details of how that's going to transpire. But what Maine did in November of this past year was pass by overwhelming margins a question that was put on Maine's ballot by about 100,000 Mainers who signed petitions under our Citizens Initiative petitioning process, which you may not have in Minnesota, as I understand, but in Maine, we do have a direct democracy route. And this measure got on the Maine's ballot through that route. And when it showed up on the ballot, Maine people did what I expected Maine people will do, which is speak yet again in a tremendously cross-partisan, nonpartisan fashion that they believe that money in politics is a corrosive, damaging, it's in a corrosive and damaging place for our democracy and the survival of our democracy. This follows on the question one win, which got more votes than any other measure ever in Maine history, bearing in mind it was a presidential election year. Follows on another measure which I had the privilege of chairing the previous year, which banned foreign governments from electioneering in Maine, which strangely is within the law and needs to be closed down by the states. But also that measure called upon our congressional delegation to pass an amendment to the United States Constitution to allow for the reasonable regulation of money in politics. That was 2023, the year before question one in 2024. That measure in an off year didn't get as many votes as the one this past November, but got a higher percentage than any matter ever on Maine's ballot, 86%. I mean, you get 86% of people to agree on anything in a state, it means that it's pretty overwhelming consensus on it. And of course, what's happened is with question one, specifically, it's designed to limit the power and the growing metastasizing power of super PACs that are running our elections. And it does it by simply limiting the amount of contributions that a super PAC can make for a candidate to $5,000, which is the limit that ordinary human beings have. And I think it's a reasonable limitation, so do apparently an overwhelming number of Maine people.
I'm curious how you settled on the $5,000 figure. Why not 1,000 or why not 20,000?
Well, Larry can get into this, but I think 5,000 is a number which it follows along other regulations and laws that exist, with respect to regulating money in politics. And so I think it's ultimately fully expect this law to be challenged. It has been challenged, and I think it was designed to withstand the challenges. And Larry can get into the legal side of it, but it's a good number. It's not too high and it's not too low. It's, people in Maine, may want to speak in elections. They may want to spend some money in election, and $5,000 is a good place to land, I think.
Well, and it's certainly a far cry from the millions of dollars that we have heard about in this last cycle that some of our wealthy class have put into super PACs. But yes, Professor Lessig, let's get you involved in this, because I understand that the impetus for this came from you and your organization. Tell us about that.
Well, I'm not going to take all credit for it, because there's so many people who have been working to get the Supreme Court to finally address a question the court has never addressed, which is whether contributions to independent political action committees are protected by the First Amendment in the way that expenditures are. So we know from the case Citizens United decided 15 years ago, this month.
This week, yeah.
Yeah, this week. That individuals, corporations, unions, political action committees are free to spend unlimited amounts of money in a campaign as long as that spending is independent of the candidate. And the reasoning behind that is that if the spending is independent, and many of us will roll our eyes and say, we don't believe it's independent, but just you got to go with the logic for a second. If the spending is independent, then there's no risk of the kind of corruption the Supreme Court says is the only corruption Congress can address. So the corruption is what's called quid pro quo, this for that. And the court said, if it's independent, there's no quid pro quo corruption, or another way to see that is, if there's a quid pro quo, it's not independent. So that case is a case that upholds the right to spend unlimited amounts of money because, by this logic, there could be no corruption. But it was just 3 months after that case was decided that a lower federal court, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, in March of 2010, addressed the related question, which is, if you can spend unlimited amounts of money, as long as it's independent, can you contribute unlimited amounts of money to a committee that will then make that unlimited expenditure? And in a kind of slippery bit of logic, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals made what, from from the perspective of today, is a completely obvious mistake. When the court said, in fact, there could be no quid pro quo corruption in the contribution if there's no quid pro quo corruption in the expenditure. Okay, now it kind of sounds like that might sound logical, but there's just one clear case that shows that this just isn't true. You might remember my favorite senator, Robert Menendez from New Jersey, a Democratic senator who was indicted. The indictment was in 2015. Indictment was for quid pro quo corruption. And the quid pro quo was that he would give favors to a Florida businessman in exchange for the Florida businessman's contribution to the Political Action Committee, the Independent Political Action Committee, the super PAC that was supporting Robert Menendez. So there was plain quid pro quo corruption involving a contribution to a super PAC, the thing that the DC Circuit said couldn't happen. And indeed, the lawyers for Menendez had the chutzpah to argue that the indictment should be dismissed because the thing he was charged with, the DC Circuit said couldn't happen. Of course, they didn't dismiss the indictment, but the point is, it pointed out the mistake, really logical mistake, that the DC Circuit has made. And since that time, there have been a long line of people, beginning with my former colleague Al Alschuler and Larry Tribe, my colleague here at Harvard, who began writing about this. Richard Painter, who's a professor in Minnesota, also joined in that article to point out this logical mistake. And then there have been activist groups like Free Speech for People and my group, Equal Citizens, that have been trying to tee the question up so that the court finally has a chance to address the question. Because we believe when the court gets the question, it will recognize the mistake. And it will say, yes, you are free to spend whatever you have, but the state has the right to regulate the contribution when there's a risk of corruption. And plainly, with these contributions of millions and millions of dollars, there's a risk of corruption in that contribution.
So let's be clear, this approach does not outlaw super PACs or put them out of business, but it limits how much individuals can contribute to those PACs.
That's right.
With the idea that
the word super PAC was created by a journalist after this DC Circuit opinion, because what it meant was there was no limit to the contribution you could make. That's what makes it a super PAC. The $5,000 number is the same number that exists in the existing federal law limiting contributions to independent political action committees. That was the law that the DC Circuit struck down. But we believe that if the Supreme Court upholds Maine's law, then the logic of that decision could very well revive the federal law as well. Just like you remember after the Dobbs decision, all the state anti-abortion laws came back to life. There's a chance that if Maine's law is upheld in the right way, the federal super PAC law would also come back to life. So not only would there be no super PACs at the state level in Maine, there would be no super PACs at the federal level either.
But when you say no super PACs, what this really would do would be seriously deplete them, right?
There would exactly right. There would be independent political action committees, just like there are dependent political action committees. Like, a corporation can set up a political action committee. That political action committee is limited in the size of the contributions it can accept. It can coordinate its work with the candidate. That's why it's not independent. There would be independent political action committees, but the thing about them is that they could only accept contributions up to, in Maine, $5,000, and if the federal law is revived, $5,000 as well. And so they would exist, but they wouldn't have the extraordinary power that they have right now, which creates this, what I think of as a corrupting dependence of our representatives on these very few super PAC funders. And that's the corruption this case has a chance to get rid of.
Well, and Professor, it sounds as if you went into this exercise in Maine very much intent on getting a good case before the Supreme Court. And Senator Bennett, I wonder if that was well understood in Maine as well, that this was teeing up a court case.
I believe that Maine people may miss the details of what happens after they vote. Some do. Others who focused on this knew that this bill was likely to be challenged. They voted for it anyway. But Maine people are speaking out loudly on this question again, and taking the super out of the super PAC is a good thing, and I think they understood that, and they know that money is run amok. They know that they've lost control of their democracy, that we've turned into an oligarchy. And I mean, you can just look at events of the last few days and see who's sitting behind, the representatives of the people. And I mean, these are facts that are not lost on anybody. And I'm very optimistic. I run for office because I believe in change. I believe the people's will out, and I think that we'll win this one eventually too, particularly when we have such amazing people like Professor Lessig, who will be helping defend it and helping Maine's Attorney General defend this law.
Well, I want to be sure our listeners realize that you are speaking as a Republican state senator, and that this has a very bipartisan signature in Maine. Tell us a little bit about that, if you would.
Sure. I just believe, first of all, Maine, like Minnesota, has a kind of rollicking freedom with respect to partisan attachments, and
at least we used to.
Well, the same's true in Maine. We've lost a lot of ground there, but there are a few out here that still cling to that model of cross-partisanship, of actually doing the people's business in a collaborative fashion and setting party labels aside and using them only perhaps as guideposts. But everybody knows, and I don't care whether you're on the right or the left, that if you're an ordinary citizen, your voice is being smothered. $1 million megaphones coming from the super wealthy are what's turning our democracy into a caricature. And as a candidate, I have to say that you run for office, you want to get a message out. You want to speak to the people about something that you care about that's probably unique to your own personal experience, your motivations for running, what you're trying to contribute to the community. And when a super PAC can come in and drown out the voice of the candidate and drown out the debate that the candidates want to engage in between themselves to turn an election into something that the people don't want, the candidates don't want, but the interests behind the super PAC want to make it, we've got a derelict system that needs repair.
Well, I think that is pretty widely appreciated. At least the Maine vote would suggest as much. Tell us a little bit about the campaign that was waged then in Maine. Was there organized opposition to this?
So, unhappily, the opposition has basically often will stand down when they know they're on the wrong side of an issue electorally, because they think that they can win in other venues that they control more carefully. I think they may not be aware that they're vulnerable on this one and in other areas as well. But I think they just realized that this was going to become law, that Maine people think that what they're peddling is something they don't want to buy. And so they just don't go to that market. Instead, they fight it out on terrain of their choosing. So as soon as this law passed, there was a group of people who spend money in Maine elections that decided to sue the state of Maine over this. The group is led by a Republican state representative. I find it just horrible that my colleagues in the legislature, and I say this because on this particular case, the group suing is led by a Republican state legislator. In the case that's resulting from the law we passed the previous year, one of the cases was led by a sitting Democratic state legislator. You know, the outrage of a sitting member of the legislature suing their own constituents for exercising their self-determination is appalling. And yet this is what we've come to. And apparently people don't pay a political price for such thing. Why? Because they know they have the backing of these super PACs and other moneyed interests that will defend them. We've gotten to a very bad place, and I think everybody realizes it, and sometimes things need to get really bad in order to get better, and this is where we are.
Well, you're inviting me, I think, to ask Professor Lessig for a little more history lesson. You touched on some of this history, Professor, in your earlier remarks, but we in Minnesota have had this campaign finance issue on the back burner for such a long time. We maybe need a little refresher about how it got this bad with regard to super PACs. Is this strictly a creation of Citizens United and its aftermath?
It's a creation of this misinterpretation of Citizens United. You know, modern campaign finance law begins 50 years ago in a case called Buckley versus Vallejo. And in that case, the court said, you can limit contributions, you can't limit spending. And you can limit contributions so long as there's a risk of corruption. And that rule was criticized at the time, but it was the law in a pretty settled way all the way through Citizens United. And when the DC Circuit said that you can't limit either contributions or expenditures, they created this gap that before hadn't existed, this loophole, this obvious way through which huge amounts of money could be dumped into the political system to benefit the donor and make the representatives dependent on them. And when they did that, when that decision was made, the Attorney General decided not to take this case to the Supreme Court, because at that time, independent political action committees were a tiny slice of political spending. Because like if you were going to give your money either to an independent political action committee capped at $5,000 or to a regular political action committee capped at $5,000, you're much more likely to want to give it to the regular committee because that committee can work with the candidate. It's much more effective, much more efficient money. So there was not much independent political action committee money. And so they said there was no reason to take this issue up to the Supreme Court. And so they didn't take it up to the Supreme Court. And very quickly, a bunch of other lower circuit courts followed the DC Circuit. So the law got settled before we saw the disaster it had created. And then you started to see this explosion in independent political action committee contributions and spending, never more extreme than it was this year in this election. Not just an explosion in the size, but also concentration in a very few number of people. So when people use these fancy words like oligarchy, it's really hard not to see the system that we've allowed to evolve as a kind of oligarchy. And, you know, you're a historian, maybe, you feel the same thing I do when you think about the framers of our Constitution who had one objective, which was to liberate us from the aristocracy and the monarchy of Britain and to establish a republic, which, as Madison said, would be a system where there would be a branch that would be, quote, dependent on the people alone. And then in Federalist 57, he clarified that to say by the people he meant, quote, not the rich more than the poor. They were keenly focused on erasing this inequality and embracing the idea of equal citizenship. And the idea that we've now evolved a doctrine of law that says that the super, super wealthy have no limits in their ability to basically buy candidates and elections is a perversion of that original idea. And one of the core ideas that we're going to be pushing in this case is not just the standard mistake that we think that the DC Circuit made, but it's to call on the conservatives on the court who say that they believe in the original meaning of the Constitution and say to them, okay, fine, where's your original meaning now? Because the original meaning of the First Amendment certainly never would have restricted the ability of a state like Maine to protect its democracy from the corrupting influence of super wealthy donors. And if they apply their principles, then I think it's clear we win.
Well, you're making me wish that I had written down in doing some homework for this program, some of the statistics on how big that independent expenditure side, that super PAC spending side has become. Do you have some statistics that you regularly cite to help us understand the scope of this problem?
Well, now we're getting into the $3 and $4.5 billion range from these expenditures. The more interesting is to begin to think, and we haven't calculated yet because the final reports have just been filed, the percentages. But the really interesting thing is to see the really small number of people who are making these extraordinary contributions. I mean, the famous ones, for example, Elon Musk contributing $277 million or spending $277 million in this campaign. But he wasn't the only one. I mean, the Republicans will say there were more billionaires giving money to Kamala Harris, and it's certainly true. Kamala Harris spent way more money than Donald Trump. But one of the most interesting criticisms of Kamala Harris's campaign came from Bernie Sanders, who said the problem with her campaign was she did not talk about working class issues. But in her defense, she couldn't afford to talk about working class issues because she had so much money from these super PACs that she couldn't say anything that was going to alienate or isolate them against her campaign. So she had to speak in this way that was going to keep them happy and therefore not excite the base to support her in the election.
Wow. So next step is the courts with the lawsuit that has already been filed about the Maine. And I suspect, I want to be clear that that means that the referendum has been suspended, waiting for litigation now in Maine. Am I right about that?
The Attorney General has said he will not enforce it at least through May. So that gives the district court a chance to make its initial determination.
And does this go through the usual hoops of district court, appellate court, Supreme Court, or is there a way to expedite this to the Supreme Court?
It won't be expedited, but I mean, the great opportunity, the reason why Maine was such a perfect place to do this is not just the points that Rick was making about the character of Maine, and it's not just the fact that we could win in a beautifully purple state overwhelmingly with support from Republicans and Democrats alike. It's also because it's one of the very few circuit courts, the First Circuit Court of Appeals, that has never addressed this question before. So they will consider it against a clean slate background. And it's a very good court, very small court, but with really super judges. And we're very, very optimistic with that when they listen to the arguments and they actually compare what we're saying to what the Supreme Court is saying, they'll agree that what we're saying is the Supreme Court's existing doctrine upholds the Maine initiative. And if the First Circuit agrees with us, then the Supreme Court will have to take the case. So we think it could be by 2026, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, that the Supreme Court will either declare us independent of super PACs or give us another reason for a revolution. Either way, I think.
Amen.
Well, you do have a little hyperbole there, but not much, because this has become a really important issue. And I wonder, Senator Bennett, if you comment about how now that this thing has passed so overwhelmingly in Maine, what the expectation level is among Maine's voters that we are about to see some improvement in our political system.
I think the ground is very ready for sowing lots of seeds in the area of campaign finance reform. I'm busy doing that in the state legislative level. I was just reviewing my list of bills. You know, we have like in Minnesota, we have clean elections. I think we may have beaten Minnesota to that one actually. In forming Maine's Clean Election Act. Since its founding, I've always run as a clean election candidate and have encouraged when I was leading party caucuses, our candidates on the Republican side to run under the Clean Election Act. And because I think it makes races more competitive and you can get people to run that might not otherwise run and you can kind of free yourself on an individual basis from the tyranny of the money chase. And but that is obviously undermined by this big behemoth coming into the room and spending money, as I said, drowning you out. But I think that there's a lot of expectation. There's a lot of cynicism, sadly, where people are just, like, well, this is the way it is. And what it does is it manifests itself in very unpleasant ways and allows, demagoguery to prevail on occasion because people have grown really cynical about the connection between money and power, their political power specifically. And but it's also, as I said, on the flip side, it has ripened the soil for reform efforts. I've got a bill based on Arizona law that's going to be considered by the Maine legislature this year that will shine a light in the dark corners of dark money by requiring truth and disclosure for $5,000 at the $5,000 level again, way back to the original source. So if you're giving money to a PAC and it's in excess of $5,000, you need to disclose your $5,000 donors. If they're not the original source, they need to disclose their $5,000, all the way back to the dark money billionaire at the back of the line. We're putting that bill in. I've got a bill in to expand Maine's Clean Election Act to races for sheriff and district attorney, where we've seen some unfortunate amounts of spending that is suspect. When you're dealing with law enforcement officials in particular, they need to be above reproach. There's a lot of other efforts that we're working on in Maine because it's palpable that Maine people are interested in reform, and it's not a partisan thing. There used to be a real ideology that I observed between the right and the left on campaign spending. There was this sense among the people on the right that, well, look, this is freedom, and the Supreme Court says we can spend money, and this is like freedom. The people on the right now get it. They know that that's a fraud. But on the same time, the people on the left who are all for that are now benefiting a lot from dark money billionaires coming in through super PACs. And so they're like, maybe not. So but you're seeing overall, that's just in the political class. Among all the people, the base, both on the left and the right, people are outraged. And since the base is where a lot of political debate happens in party primaries and caucuses these days, that's meaningful. So if you're in office and you're not dealing with this issue, A, you're not being a smart politician, but B, you're also damaging the future of our republic.
Well, I think that's well said. And Professor, I'm aware that you have written since the election rather recently about America's loss of confidence in government itself. And I would be interested in you picking up on his comments about the cynicism of the electorate in this realm. What is the way we are financing our campaigns really contributing to the loss of confidence in government as an enterprise?
Yes, it is, because people believe that what government is doing is either completely inefficient, it can't accomplish anything, or just corrupt. It's just serving the interest of the people who are paying for it. And so that produces this resistance to the idea that government has a role in doing anything. Why would you trust it? Like, you have to be a fool to trust it, or you must be on the inside if you're trusting it because you're just trying to benefit from it. And, I think that this is continuous with a long effort. Ronald Reagan kicked it off, I think, in his first inaugural address where he said, the government's not the solution, the government is the problem. But then after that, you saw people who are actively against government addressing problems being appointed to the departments that were supposed to be solving those problems. So like you'd be appointed to HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, and you don't believe in housing and urban development. So you do the job in a terrible way to convince people government shouldn't be doing anything to have anything to do with housing and urban development. And to the extent we weaken people's confidence that there's any purpose for government or government can do anything, it reinforces the sense that we should just cut taxes and back away, like there shouldn't be anything left for what government does. And I feel like, I'm not a Republican. I was when I was a kid, but I'm not a Republican now. I think on my side, the Democrats are just sometimes just so oblivious to the deep, deep skepticism that people have about the ideas they talk about. They come forward with all these great ideas, and I do think they're great ideas for addressing problems that we all agree are real problems, but they don't hear the way in which that sounds to someone who doesn't believe that government is either capable or honest. And if we don't restore the sense that there's integrity in what government can do and that there's a capacity and a need for them to solve problems, then the party that is advancing those ideas will always lose. And I think money is a core part in causing that loss of trust.
Well, and I appreciated the advice you gave in that piece to pundits like me. Don't call it campaign finance reform. Call it corruption, because that's how people perceive it.
That's exactly right. I think, we democracy nerds, I've, been in this field now for 18 years in democracy reform. And, we get riled up in all sorts of very fancy ways to think about the problem. And try to persuade each other that we've got the coolest new trick to deal with the weirdest little bit of the democracy problem. So like in this last election cycle, there was $160 million spent by democracy reform organizations to try to advance reform to the primary system and ranked choice voting. Two ideas that I think are fantastic ideas. But all of those efforts were basically failures. One effort in Alaska defended ranked choice voting, but none of them achieved the kind of result that they were focused on because it didn't trigger ordinary people's understandings of what's wrong with our political system. Even though I think they were right that the way ranked choice voting is a great way to deal with close elections, and Maine took the lead on that just about 4 years ago. I think it's a fantastic solution to many problems. It doesn't trigger recognition in ordinary people, but money does, corruption does. And my belief is we have to start where the people are. Progress begins where the people are. And we could build an extraordinary reform if we could build on top of this corrupting influence of money, and if we could deliver some results. Now, at the introduction, the suggestion was that people are not interested in this issue because they don't think there's anything you can do about it. And I think that's right. Way back at the beginning of the work I was doing in this, we did a poll and we found 96% of Americans, 96%, believed it was important to reduce the influence of money in politics. 91% didn't think it was possible. Yeah. And so that's the politics of resignation. I mean, of course, we'd all like to fly like Superman, but we don't jump off of tall buildings because we're pretty convinced we can't do it. But if you begin to give people the sense of hope, if you give them a sense that there's something to do, there's an enormous amount of energy out there, just latent energy that would be deployed in favor of fighting for what people actually want. And I think that's true here. We need to win this fight. And if we win this fight, it's not going to solve the problems of money in politics. Citizens United is still a problem. We're not going to get Citizens United overturned in the Supreme Court. And we don't need to solve the super PAC problem. But it still will be a problem to have Citizens United and many other decisions of this court that have created this weird system that protects wealth against democracy. So there's more work to be done, including, as Rick Bennett has been part of the movement in Maine to get an amendment to the Constitution to overturn Citizens United, including an amendment. But we have to start and win and convince people there's a fight worth fighting. And I think that that's what the Maine initiative will give people the sense of.
Well, that is kind of what has attracted us in Minnesota to call you in Maine and find out what's going on, because we too have a sense that you're onto something here. You just touched on one of the points that one of our listener questions addresses, and that is that we don't have to overturn Citizens United to make progress in this realm. And that's important, isn't it, Professor?
It is, because I think, Bernie Sanders is somebody who I have an enormous admiration for, and he is one of the most articulate critics of the current system of money in American politics. And he'll give any number of speeches where he'll talk about super PACs as the overwhelming cause of the corruption inside of our political system right now. And in saying that, he is right. But then he will go on to say, and so therefore we have to overturn Citizens United. And when most people who know what Citizens United means hears that, they realize, well, that means it's hopeless. There's just nothing to do here. Because if you're telling me that you need the Supreme Court to overturn Citizens United, there are not the votes on the Supreme Court to reverse Citizens United, not even close.
No, we're talking about a 30 or a 40-year project to make that happen.
That's right, or an amendment to the Constitution. And I would certainly support the amendment. But the point is, if you can get people to see that you don't need to overturn Citizens United to end super PACs, that would be an enormous benefit. It's not everything, but I think it's 80% of everything. And if you could do that and then revive the sense that there's a reason to fight for clean elections, we could begin to revive that movement. It would make money not the determining factor in how candidates crafted their campaign. I mean, Maine and Arizona and Minnesota and Connecticut led the country in trying to get clean elections by helping to fund elections in a way that made it so candidates were not dependent on the very few to fund their campaigns. But that movement stopped after the birth of super PACs because people said, what's the reason to be spending public money when a rich person can come in and just wipe it out? And so that's why winning this will be essential to reviving the movement that at least a number of states have begun to take up.
A number of our questioners are asking, what can Minnesota do? Would it be helpful or hurtful to the cause if Minnesota were to pass something similar to what Maine has done here? What do you think, both Professor and Senator Bennett? What do you think?
Well, I mean, there's lots that Minnesota can do in the course of the litigation and joining with amicus briefs in the litigation. But the reality is, if we win in the First Circuit, we will be in the Supreme Court. If we lose in the First Circuit, we won't be in the Supreme Court. And so that really will determine whether there's other work to be done elsewhere. But I think this is the best shot. The First Circuit is the best place to consider this question. And I think that we've pulled together exactly the kind of understanding that would lead them to get to the right answer.
Yeah, Minnesota is in the Eighth Circuit, and they've not been known as a bunch of reformers. So we'll leave it the First Circuit to deal with this and cheer you on. But you think your chances are quite good? People are asking you to please assess your chances in this litigation.
Well, I can say this. Look, I'm a law professor, and I grade people on their ability to understand legal arguments, right? And that's different from predicting whether the legal arguments will prevail. So let me say, on the legal argument front, it is absolutely correct to say that the Supreme Court existing jurisprudence would uphold Maine's right to pass this law. Now, will the Supreme Court apply its existing jurisprudence in a consistent way? I feel like the last naive law professor, but I'm going to say yes. In fact, I think, one critical part of this argument, as I said, will be to appeal to the originalists. I think that there's a good shot we get the originalists and the core part of the court and the three liberals or non-conservatives on the court. And that we get not just 5 votes, but maybe as many as 7 votes in favor of this. Because the reality is, there's not even a political reason for them not to want to agree with Maine. As this last election showed, the money is not benefiting the Republicans exclusively. In fact, the money's supposedly now we have Democrats spending more money, raising more money in both this election and the last election in super PACs than the Republicans. So there's not a partisan reason to be favoring upholding this rule or not. And the other thing is the politics of the court itself. I think the United States Supreme Court would love the opportunity to say, look, here are our principles. And if you apply our principles to this case, you get the result that super PACs can be limited. And that would surprise people because they would say, it's not what we thought your principles would say, but if that's your principles, that's fine. They could demonstrate that their principles are not just, very result oriented to just let rich people do whatever they want. Now, on the other side, let's just be very honest about one important fact. The group that has challenged the law in Maine is supported by a man named Leonard Leo. Leonard Leo is a Maine citizen, or lives in Maine. I don't know if he's a citizen of Maine. Leonard Leo is the biggest super PAC funder or person raising money for super PACs. He received the largest single donation of $1.6 billion to support the work that he was doing around judicial reform.
We should say that he's the leader of the Federalist Society.
Federalist Society, right? So it's not like it's not like we're going up against nobody. We're going up against the strongest guy that there is in the field. But we'll see. The court could do the right thing, or the court could do the Leonard Leo thing, and we'll see which way they go.
I'd like to get Senator Bennett back into this and ask him, as you think about what might happen in other states, what support, if any, would you look for from other states at this point, Senator?
I think that Larry has spoken well on this particular case, but for me, what we all need to do as citizens is bring this fight, yes, on the question that we're talking about tonight, yes, on one, yes, on clean elections, yes, on getting rid of or shining the light on dark money. We need to do it all. And Minnesota has an opportunity to just follow Maine's lead here a little bit in doing what is natural to all of the people of Minnesota, which is find whatever is going to work in Minnesota and fight the battle on that ground. Look for the opportunities. If you don't, you don't have a citizens initiative opportunity, but I know that you've got, a legislature which is pretty open to and accessible, and people should demand of their legislators that they make reforms, fix this broken system, and be creative about it. And there's a lot of experimentation. There's a lot of national groups out there, as Larry said, with their own solutions to what's broken in our democracy. I agree that too often people are looking down and like worrying about things that don't communicate well, and that's a great point. But it's the money. Focus on the money. What I like to say is that this is the issue that starts that begins before all the other issues. If you're concerned about housing, if you're concerned about energy, if you're concerned about social issues, you're going to hit the wall because there's going to be some well-funded interest group with millions upon millions of dollars that's going to frustrate you. You got to deal with this issue first. And that's why anybody who cares about any advancements in public policy ought to lean into campaign. I won't call it campaign finance reform. I'll call it corruption, the corruption issues, because they manifest themselves in different ways, right? But this is the issue that everybody should galvanize themselves around. So, find the Minnesota way on this. On this problem of corruption. Draw attention to it. Talk about it. Do what you're doing tonight by having sessions like this. Get people agitated and informed, and that's how we make change in this country. I do believe that. I think that in the great sweep of history, the embarrassment of America because of the system that we've created just in the last 10 or 20 years, is going to catch up to us. And I think the Supreme Court is susceptible to embarrassment, and they should be. They're human beings. They think that corporations are people or whatever, just an absurdity on the face of it. But, at some point, they got to know what they've created. And as students of the Constitution, as people who love the Constitution, they have to know that what they're doing is anathema to the future existence of a constitutional republic of the United States. And
Well, yes, I'm sure you were too alarmed when I saw in the New York Times just last weekend a poll that showed that 9 out of 10 Americans believe our political system is broken. 9 out of 10. We can't get 9 out of 10 Americans to agree that the sun's going to come up in the east tomorrow morning. It made me wonder whether this move, important as this move is sufficient. It made me wonder whether we can do enough quickly enough to revive confidence in democracy in this country. And I would be interested in both of your comments on that. Professor, why don't you start, and then I'll come back to you, Senator Bennett. What do you think? Can we do enough to reverse what has been a precipitous slide in confidence in our system?
Well, first, this isn't enough. This single victory is not enough. I think Rick is completely right that there are 15 or 20 fights to be had, and we've got to build the motivation to have those 15 or 20 fights. Now, even if we had those 15 or 20 fights and we won them, is that going to be enough? I don't know. But, it reminds me, I've told this story before, but I once was speaking at Dartmouth, and after I finished, a woman stood up and she said, Professor, you've convinced me it's hopeless. There's nothing we can do. And I thought, oh, that's pretty much a failure. And for some reason at that moment in my head, the image of my then 6-year-old son appeared. And I thought to myself, what if a doctor said to me, your son has terminal brain cancer and there's nothing you can do? Would I do nothing? Would I just accept this is the way things are going to be? And of course, you recognize that's what love means. Love means you're going to do everything you can, regardless of the odds. The odds are not what's important. Mm-hmm. And we love our country. We love the ideals that we teach our children, and we think about, and we rally people to. And if you have that love, whether we can do it or not, you know what you need to do. Whether you're going to win or not, you know what you need to fight. And I think Rick is exactly right. Henry David Thoreau wrote once, for every 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, there's one striking at the root. This is the root. If you solve this problem, the corruption problem, it'll be so much easier to solve the healthcare problem, the inequality problem, the infrastructure problem, the problem of endless defense spending. All of those are solvable if you can take money off the table. And that's why whether you think we're going to win this for ourselves or our children, you have to fight for it.
Mm-hmm. And Senator Bennett, what would be your comments about whether we can do enough at this point?
Yeah, I would just, first of all, that was very eloquent, Larry, and one of the reasons I respect you so deeply for your leadership here. I would just reflect on the notion that what makes our country is vigilance of the people, constant vigilance. I mean, Thomas Jefferson said this is critical. I mean, everything about a republic and our democracy is about change, that we have the capacity to make the changes, and we need to defend what's important to us repeatedly and always. And that's been the history of our country. And I have a great deal of confidence that that bedrock remains, and that this is what we need to do. This is the project of America. It's not just sitting back and, oh, we wrote a constitution 225 years ago, and now we can sit back. No, and we've seen this throughout our history. We need to constantly work at it. It is a work in progress, and it requires all of us to participate. And that's why I think when people give up, and resign, and that is the worst part of it, because that's anti-American. Giving up is not what our country is about. Fixing what is right in front of us right now, and using all of our energies and our God-given talent to fix what's right. That's what has made our country great, and that's why I think we can fix this problem, and it will get fixed. I just hope it gets fixed in time.
Yeah, me too. Well, listen, it's not to me a coincidence at all that Maine has been a leader in this. Maine also a leader in ranked choice voting. Minnesota has been very interested in ranked choice voting, and we have now a number of our major cities in this state using ranked choice voting at the municipal level. We're interested in reform here too. We haven't given up here too. So we're very interested in what you've accomplished, and we'll be rooting for you at the First Circuit and then hopefully onto the Supreme Court if that's what it takes to get this changed. So I thank you very much. It's been quite an evening.
Thank you.
It's been great. Thank you.
I don't know if Mary Hartnett's going to jump back in to say goodnight. Maybe she is, or maybe someone else, but seeing none, I think I will say goodnight. And thank you all for listening tonight.
Great. Thank you.